Hello, my name is Russell Myers. Welcome to Issues Unite. So, some people prefer that I offer sources from which I quote. So, I'm going to start off with that. Yes, I have vetted the information, though the site that I'm quoting is typically very accurate, except for having pro oil industry leanings, but that's the purpose of the site. This particular writer is rather conservative, so I tend to read his writing and vet it more critically than some. So anyway, one note, the bill that is referenced in here is not something that was conceived of or written by Trump. This is something that certain members of Congress have been trying to pass for years, but it is actually opposed by the U.S. oil and gas industry. That tells you just how bad it is. So, starting with a quote, Republican Senator Kevin Cramer of North Dakota, who has advised Trump on energy issues, has been calling on the White House to take action to stop very large crude carriers from unloading, and several senators and congressmen have threatened to veto to withhold military aid to Saudi Arabia. Trump, for his part, has so far only said that he will look at it, referring to stopping those new imports. Specifically, the NOPEC Bill would make it illegal to, listen to this wording, artificially cap oil and gas production or to set prices as OPEC Plus, and Saudi Arabia do. Got that? All right. The bill would also immediately remove the sovereign immunity that presently exists in U.S. courts for OPEC as a group and for each and every one of its individual member states. This would leave Saudi Arabia open to being sued under U.S. antitrust legislation, with its total liability being its estimated $1 trillion of investments in the U.S. alone. The U.S. would then be legally entitled to freeze all Saudi bank accounts in the U.S., seize its assets in the country, and halt all use of U.S. dollars by the Saudis anywhere in the world. Oil, of course, to begin with, is denominated in U.S. dollars. It would allow the U.S. to go after Saudi Aramco and its assets and funds, as it is still a majority state-owned production and trading vehicle, and would mean that Aramco would be ordered to break itself up into smaller constituent companies that are not deemed to break competition rules in the oil, gas, and petrochemical sectors or to influence the oil price. So that's from an article from oilprice.com, and I will put the link below. So what this is saying is that OPEC Plus members would be unable to cap oil production to manipulate oil prices. What's entertaining about this is that the current state of oil prices causing the collapse of the shale oil industry was caused by overproduction, not by capping oil production. Basically, this is an attempt to threaten Saudi Arabia with seizure of assets and imposing lawsuits against them. And it is also a threat against other oil-producing countries. All right? One threat being issued is ceasing military aid to Saudi Arabia. I've mentioned before on several occasions that Saudi Arabia is involved in peace talks with Yemen. The assassination of Iranian General Soleimani took place as he was allegedly carrying diplomatic documents from Iran to Iraq in an attempt at peace talks between Iran and Saudi Arabia, with Iraq acting as a middleman in the diplomatic talks. And this was largely confirmed when officials from both Iran and Saudi Arabia stated that the talks will still occur in spite of the assassination. So Saudi Arabia already has some level of diplomatic ties with Israel and is working toward peace with Yemen. If Iraq and Iran also succeed in peace talks with Saudi Arabia, then what military aid would Saudi Arabia need from the U.S.? Would Israel attempt to attack Saudi Arabia if Saudi Arabia has diplomatic ties with Iran and Iraq and Syria? Or, well, isn't it likely that Syria would be included in that arrangement at some near future point? Most likely. Another thing to keep in mind is that Saudi Arabia has improved ties with Russia and China, who also manufacture and sell military equipment. They sell that equipment at lower expense and equal or better quality and faster delivery than the U.S. does. So, what they're not likely to do is, for Russia and China, what Russia and China are not likely to do is provide military personnel other than for training on the use of the equipment they sell. And once again, how much military personnel do you need if you are not in active conflict or threat of conflict? If you've already had peace talks and are working toward peace with all of your neighbors, how much military personnel do you need? And would the U.S. help to defend Saudi Arabia if Israel attacked Saudi Arabia? Honestly, if I were Saudi Arabia, I would act upon the U.S. threat of seizing their assets by withdrawing all funds in U.S. bank accounts, then shutting down all oil-producing facilities in the U.S. and hanging a for sale sign on them. Keep in mind that Saudi Arabia owns the largest oil processing facility in the U.S., and no U.S. oil corporation has the liquidity at the moment to even entertain the fantasy of buying that facility. So that would force the U.S. oil industry to need so much subsidization from the government as to mandate the nationalization of oil processing. If Saudi Arabia simply ceases all oil sales to the U.S., what would happen is that this would force the U.S. oil industry to stop exporting oil and sell all production domestically. The end result would be the absolute collapse of the petrodollar. Saudi Arabia could easily sell oil in a different currency, elevating that currency to reserve status. The loss of Saudi oil being traded in dollars, along with the inability to export U.S. oil to sell in dollars, would plummet the dollar in international trade, especially right now. Saudi Arabia and other countries would then pick up the portion of oil currently sold to the European Union by the U.S. We would lose those sales. Saudi Arabia and other OPEC countries and OPEC Plus countries would pick up those sales and most likely sell it in other currencies, not the dollar. Keep in mind that the U.S. has imposed sanctions on every single large-scale oil-producing nation. Venezuela, Iran, Russia, and Syria. Meanwhile, Iraq has come to severely oppose U.S. control and requirements which limit their sovereign profit derived from their own oil. Remove those countries from oil production and trade, and the remainder of oil-producing countries are really little more than bit players. Note that the part of the quote from above refers to forcing Saudi Aramco to break up. While Aramco is a corporation, the Saudi royal family holds controlling shares. Forcing them to break up by utilizing international courts seems highly unlikely. Imposing fines in U.S. federal court would be nearly impossible to enforce, especially if Saudi Arabia discontinues oil trade with the U.S. If the U.S. did manage to succeed in forcing Aramco to break up, what could be the international blowback from this against U.S. corporations? And, of course, inclusive to all of this is what I have mentioned before regarding weapons sales. If Saudi Arabia stops buying weapons from the U.S., weapons manufacturing companies in the U.S. would suffer. And that would lead them to lay off thousands, tens of thousands of workers. Meanwhile, their stocks would plummet in value because that would be a loss of at least $10 billion a year in revenue. Of course, all of this is likely to be nothing more than a completely empty threat which will change nothing. If it passes, it's going to be catastrophic, as I've detailed here. No matter what, it seems like Saudi Arabia is taking steps which are designed to reduce arms purchases from the U.S. while concurrently forcing the U.S. shale industry out of business. All of which plays into the fantasy I detailed last week. Maybe it's not so much of a fantasy after all. I mean, we can hope, can't we? I'd be very happy if this wound up that my fantasy comes true. And day after day, it just keeps on looking more likely. All right, that is it for this one. If you can, please donate $1 a month to help expand the channel. Share this video, podcast, whatever you want to call it. Talk about these issues. That's the main point. Talk about these issues. And I hope you have a good day. Bye. Later. Bye.